The morning mist hung low over the palace grounds, creating an almost ghostly silence that seemed to echo through every corridor and room. Catherine stood at the tall window of their private quarters, her fingers pressed against the cold glass as she watched the early dawn break across the gardens below. The world outside looked the same as it had yesterday, but everything had changed in the space of a single phone call. William sat on the edge of their bed, still in the clothes he had worn the night before. His phone lay silent beside him, but the weight of the conversation from hours earlier pressed down on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. The news had come at 3 a.m, delivered in the careful, measured tones that palace staff used when the world was about to shift beneath their feet. "She's really gone," Catherine whispered, her voice barely audible against the window pane. The words felt foreign on her tongue, as if speaking them might somehow make the loss more real than it already was. William looked up at his wife, seeing the way her shoulders trembled despite her attempt to stand strong. He had always admired her strength, the way she could face cameras and crowds with such grace, but this morning she looked fragile in a way that made his heart ache. Rising slowly, he crossed the room and placed his hands gently on her shoulders. "The children don't know yet," Catherine continued, leaning back against his chest. "How do we tell them? How do we explain that someone who was here yesterday, laughing with them at dinner, is never coming back?" The weight of parenthood had never felt heavier than it did in that moment. William closed his eyes and tried to find the words that would somehow make sense of loss to young minds that still believed in fairy tales and happy endings. Outside, a gardener moved slowly across the lawn, unaware that the family he served was breaking apart behind the palace walls. "We tell them together," William finally said, his voice rough with unshed tears. "We tell them that sometimes people we love have to leave us, but that doesn't mean they stop being important. That doesn't mean we stop loving them." Catherine turned in his arms, and for the first time since the phone had rung, she let herself really look at her husband. His eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion and grief. His usually perfectly styled hair disheveled from running his hands through it. He looked younger somehow, vulnerable in a way that reminded her of the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago at university. "I keep thinking I should call her," Catherine admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "Every time something happens, good or bad, she's the first person I want to talk to. Last week, when George scored his first goal at school, I picked up the phone before I remembered. How do you stop that? How do you stop reaching for someone who isn't there anymore?" William pulled her closer, feeling the familiar comfort of her warmth against him. They had faced difficult times before, moments when the pressure of their roles had threatened to overwhelm them, but this was different. This was personal in a way that no amount of royal training could have prepared them for. The palace staff had been moving quietly through the building since dawn, their faces solemn as they went about their duties. Everyone knew. News traveled fast within these walls, and by now every member of their household would have heard. There would be protocols to follow, arrangements to make, and a grieving family to support through the most difficult time of their lives. "She was so proud of us," Catherine said, remembering the last conversation they had shared just days before. "Do you remember what she said at Charlotte's birthday party? About how we were raising the children to be kind before they learned to be royal?" William smiled despite his pain, remembering the moment Catherine spoke of. She had always had a way of cutting through the formality that surrounded their lives, seeing the people beneath the titles and treating them not as future monarchs, but as a family trying to do their best. "She would want us to be strong for them," William said, though his voice wavered with the effort of believing his own words. "She always said that love doesn't end when someone dies. It just changes form." A gentle knock at their door interrupted the quiet moment between them. Catherine wiped her eyes quickly, straightening her shoulders in an automatic response that had been trained into her over years of public life. But when the door opened to reveal one of their closest staff members, a woman who had been with them since their wedding day, she let her guard drop again. "Your Royal Highnesses," the woman said softly, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. "The children are awake. They're asking questions about why everyone seems sad this morning." Catherine and William exchanged a look that spoke volumes about the conversation they were about to have, one of the hardest they would ever face as parents. Together, they walked down the hallway toward their children's rooms, their hands clasped tightly together, drawing strength from each other as they prepared to share the kind of news that would mark their children's lives forever. The palace around them continued its quiet mourning, but in that moment, they were not Duke and Duchess, not future king and queen. They were simply a mother and father, about to help their children understand that sometimes the people we love most have to say goodbye in ways we never expected. The children's playroom had always been a sanctuary within the palace walls, a place where royal protocols gave way to scattered toys and finger paintings on easels. This morning, it felt different. George sat cross-legged on the carpet, his favorite book forgotten in his lap, while Charlotte curled up in the window seat with her stuffed rabbit. Even little Louis seemed to sense the change in the air, playing more quietly than usual with his wooden blocks. Catherine knelt down beside George, her silk dress pooling around her on the floor in a way that would have horrified the palace stylists. But this morning, appearances meant nothing compared to the need to be close to her son. William settled into the armchair nearby, lifting Louis onto his lap while keeping his eyes on his eldest children. "Mummy, why does everyone look so sad today?" Charlotte asked, her voice small and uncertain. At 7 years old, she had developed an intuitive sense for the emotions of the adults around her, a skill that served her well in their unique family, but sometimes made her carry burdens too heavy for such young shoulders. Catherine took a deep breath, searching for words that would be honest but not frightening. "Do you remember how we talked about heaven, sweetheart? About how it's a beautiful place where people go when their bodies stop working?" George looked up from his book, his young face serious in a way that reminded Catherine painfully of William at that age. "Is someone we know in heaven now?" "Yes." "Darling," William said gently, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "Someone very special to all of us went to heaven last night while we were sleeping." The questions that followed were heartbreaking in their innocence. Would they see this person again? Why couldn't the doctors fix them? Could they still talk to heaven from their prayers? Catherine and William took turns answering, their voices weaving together in the careful dance of parents trying to explain the unexplainable. Charlotte climbed down from the window seat and wrapped her small arms around Catherine's neck. "It's okay to be sad, Mummy," she whispered, with the profound wisdom that children sometimes possess. "When my hamster went to heaven, you told me that loving someone means missing them when they're gone." The simple acceptance in her daughter's voice broke something loose in Catherine's chest, and for the first time that morning, she let the tears come freely. William reached over and pulled both his wife and daughter into his embrace, creating a circle of comfort that seemed to encompass their small family entirely. Over the next few hours, they moved through their day differently than usual. Breakfast was served in their private dining room instead of the more formal settings they often used, and the children were allowed to eat their cereal while sitting on their parents' laps. The staff moved around them with extra gentleness, understanding that this day called for different rules than the ones that usually governed palace life. Catherine found herself noticing details she might normally overlook, the way William's hand never left her shoulder when they stood together, how he unconsciously stepped closer to her when anyone entered the room, the way he anticipated her needs before she could voice them, bringing her tea without being asked, and steering conversations away from difficult topics when he saw her struggling. "I need to call my parents," Catherine said as they sat in William's study later that morning. The familiar room, with its leather chairs and family photographs, felt like a refuge from the formal demands that would soon descend upon them. William nodded, understanding immediately. "They'll want to come, won't they? Your mother will insist on helping with the children." The thought of her mother's practical comfort brought fresh tears to Catherine's eyes. Carol Middleton had a gift for knowing exactly what was needed in any situation, whether it was a home-cooked meal or simply sitting quietly while her daughter processed difficult emotions. "She always knew what to say to her," Catherine said, thinking of countless family gatherings where her mother and the woman they had lost had found common ground in their love for the children and their fierce protection of family privacy. "They understood each other in a way that I always admired." William pulled out his phone, scrolling through messages that had been arriving steadily since dawn. Family members, close friends, and palace officials all reaching out with condolences and offers of support. But it was the personal messages that meant the most. Memories shared, photos of happier times, and simple words of love from people who truly understood their loss. "Harry's flying in tonight," William said, reading from one of the messages. "He said he doesn't want us to go through this alone." The thought of his brother's support brought visible relief to William's face. Despite the complexities of their relationship over the years, grief had a way of stripping away everything except what truly mattered. In moments like these, they were not princes or dukes or future kings. They were simply brothers who had learned too young what it meant to lose someone precious. Catherine stood and moved to the window, looking out at the gardens, where photographers would soon gather, where the world would come to witness their family's private grief made public. The thought made her stomach tighten with familiar anxiety, but then she felt William's presence behind her, solid and reassuring. "We'll get through this," he said, not as a platitude but as a promise. "Together, like we always do." She turned to face him, seeing in his eyes the same determination that had carried them through every challenge their unique life had presented. They had learned early in their marriage that their strength lay not in perfection, but in their willingness to lean on each other when the weight became too much for one person to bear. "The speech," Catherine said suddenly, remembering the obligation that loomed ahead of them. "You'll have to speak at the service." William's jaw tightened slightly, but he nodded. "I've been thinking about what to say. How do you sum up a life in a few minutes? How do you capture everything she meant to so many people?" "You don't," Catherine said simply. "You just speak from your heart and trust that people will understand. She would want honesty, not perfection." As the afternoon wore on, their home filled with the quiet bustle of family gathering in crisis. Catherine's parents arrived with arms full of the children's favorite foods and the kind of practical help that smoothed the sharp edges of grief. Harry appeared at dinner time, tired from his journey but present in a way that reminded them all why family mattered most. The evening found them in the drawing room, children finally asleep upstairs, adults sitting together in the comfortable silence that comes when words feel inadequate. But in that silence, there was love and support, and the quiet promise that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. The morning of the farewell ceremony dawned clear and bright, as if nature itself wanted to honor the life they were celebrating. Catherine stood before her dressing-room mirror, her hands trembling slightly as she fastened the pearl earrings that had been a gift years ago. The black dress she wore was elegant but simple, chosen not for its royal appropriateness, but because it had always been a favorite of the woman they were saying goodbye to. William adjusted his tie for the third time, his own nervous energy evident in the careful precision of his movements. They had been through many formal occasions together, ceremonies and services that required them to present perfect public faces while their private emotions remained hidden. But this felt different. This was personal, in a way that made the usual protocols feel almost insulting. She would have laughed at all the fuss, Catherine said, watching through the window as officials arranged flowers and adjusted microphones in the courtyard below. Remember how she used to tease us about taking everything so seriously? William smiled despite his sadness, remembering countless family dinners where gentle humor had been used to deflate the pompousness that sometimes crept into their lives. She had a gift for that, didn't she? Making everything feel more human, more real. The children appeared in their doorway, dressed in their own formal clothes but looking uncertain about what the day would bring. George wore his first proper suit, the one that made him look heartbreakingly grown up, while Charlotte held tightly to William's hand as she navigated her small heels. Louis, still too young to fully understand the solemnity of the occasion, seemed more interested in the unusual activity around the palace than anything else. "Are we ready?" Catherine asked, though the question was directed more at herself than at her family. Ready seemed like an impossible concept when facing the final goodbye to someone who had been woven so thoroughly into the fabric of their lives. The service took place in the palace's private chapel, a space that had witnessed generations of royal celebrations and sorrows. Today, it was filled with people who had known and loved the woman they were honoring, each bringing their own memories and grief to the shared moment of farewell. Catherine found herself studying the faces around her as they sang the hymns that had been carefully chosen for their personal meaning rather than their traditional appropriateness. She saw tears on cheeks that rarely showed emotion publicly, watched as dignified individuals struggled with the same raw pain that she and William were carrying. When William rose to speak, Catherine felt her heart clench with pride and sympathy. She knew how much he had agonized over his words, how he had written and rewritten his speech, trying to capture a life that couldn't be contained in any speech, no matter how eloquent. "She taught us," William began, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "That being royal wasn't about titles or protocol. It was about service, yes, but more than that, it was about remaining human in a world that often forgets the importance of simple kindness." Catherine watched as he shared stories that painted a picture not of an official figure but of a woman who had laughed at children's jokes, who had quietly helped countless people without seeking recognition, who had treated everyone from heads of state to palace gardeners with the same genuine warmth. "She would want us to remember her, not with sadness," William continued, his eyes finding Catherine's in the congregation, "but with gratitude for the time we had, and with a commitment to carry forward the love and acceptance she showed to all of us." When the service ended and they moved to the private burial, the intimate group that followed the family felt like the gathering she would have chosen herself. No excessive crowds or media attention, just the people who had genuinely mattered to her and to whom she had genuinely mattered. Catherine stood between her children during the final prayers, one arm around Charlotte's shoulders and her free hand holding Louis steady on his feet. The weight of the moment pressed down on all of them, but there was something comforting about being together, about sharing this goodbye as a family. As earth was scattered and final words were spoken, Catherine found herself thinking not about endings, but about continuations. The lessons that had been taught, the love that had been shared, the memories that would live on in the stories they would tell their children and their children's children. The reception afterward took place in one of the palace's smaller drawing rooms, transformed for the occasion into a space that felt more like a family gathering than a formal event. People shared stories and laughter along with their tears, creating the kind of celebration of life that felt appropriate for someone who had always preferred joy to solemnity. Catherine moved through the room, accepting condolences and sharing memories, but always aware of William's presence nearby. They had developed an unspoken communication over the years, a way of checking on each other with just a look or a gentle touch. Today, that connection felt more important than ever. As the afternoon drew to a close and guests began to take their leave, the family found themselves alone together in the gathering twilight. The children, exhausted by the day's emotions, had fallen asleep curled against their grandparents on the sofas, their formal clothes wrinkled and their faces peaceful in sleep. "How do you think she would judge today?" Catherine asked, settling beside William on the window seat where they could watch the sun setting over the gardens. "I think she would be proud," William said after considering the question seriously. "Not because everything was perfect, but because it was real, because people were allowed to grieve honestly and remember honestly." Catherine leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid comfort of his presence. The day had been difficult, but it had also been healing in ways she was only beginning to understand. There had been something powerful about the shared recognition of loss, about the community that formed around grief and love. "The children will remember this," she said, watching George's sleeping face in the lamplight. "Not just the sadness, but the way everyone came together, the way love shows up even in the hardest moments." William nodded, thinking of his own childhood experiences with loss and how the support of family and friends had carried him through times when the world seemed too heavy to bear. She would want that to be her legacy, wouldn't she? Not just the individual impact she had, but the way she taught all of us to be there for each other. As night fell over the palace, they sat together in the quiet contentment that comes after difficult but necessary goodbyes. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and responsibilities, but tonight they could simply be a family who had loved and been loved, who had said farewell with dignity and grace, and who would carry forward the best of what they had been given. The mourning would continue in private moments and unexpected memories, but the celebration of a life well lived would endure in the way they chose to honor her memory through their own actions and love.